It began with a simple email that looked easy to ignore. The message was short and strangely formal, asking for volunteers to participate in a cognitive listening study. Most people who saw it probably deleted it within seconds, but 7 strangers chose to reply. Daniel was a psychology student who enjoyed understanding how the mind worked. Myra was a nurse still struggling with the loss of her father. Jacob hosted a small podcast about unusual experiments and strange mysteries. Elena was a retired music teacher who lived quietly after the passing of her sister. Marcus, a practical engineer, believed everything had a logical explanation. Priya was a graduate researcher interested in neural perception, and Thomas worked night shifts as a security guard. None of them had ever met before, yet they all found themselves standing outside the same research building on the edge of the city, a quiet laboratory known as the Cognitive Acoustic Laboratory. From the outside it looked ordinary, but the silence around the building felt strangely heavy, as if something inside was waiting for them. Inside the facility, the volunteers were welcomed by the lead researcher, Dr. Adrian Keller. Calm and professional, he explained that the study focused on how people interpret complex sound patterns. Each volunteer would sit alone in a soundproof listening room and wear specialized headphones designed to play layered audio frequencies. The goal, according to the research team, was to observe how the brain processes noise and transforms it into recognizable sound. The volunteers were escorted into identical white rooms containing a chair, a microphone, and a headset connected to recording equipment. At first the audio they heard was nothing more than static and distant murmurs hidden beneath shifting frequencies. It sounded like meaningless noise, but after a few minutes many of them began noticing something strange. The sounds started to resemble voices buried deep within the recording. Most assumed it was simply their brains trying to make sense of random patterns. But then Myra suddenly removed her headset, visibly shaken, insisting she had just heard her father's voice call her name. The staff calmly reassured Myra that auditory illusions were common during perception experiments, especially when participants listened to layered frequencies for long periods of time. Still, as the sessions continued, the reports became harder to dismiss. Elena said she heard her late sister softly humming a song from their childhood. Thomas described hearing his grandmother asking him a familiar question about his work. Even Marcus, who had entered the experiment convinced that everything had a scientific explanation, admitted the voice he heard sounded exactly like his brother who had passed away years earlier. Dr. Keller recorded every report carefully while Priya monitored brain activity from the control room. What made the situation even stranger was that the recordings themselves contained no obvious voices, only patterns of sound and static. Yet the volunteers were increasingly convinced they were hearing real, recognizable voices. Some of them felt comforted by the experience, while others grew uneasy as the voices seemed to appear more clearly the longer they listened. As the second day of testing began, Priya started to notice something unusual in the data collected from the brain scans. Each time a volunteer reported hearing a voice, a strong spike appeared in the parts of the brain connected to emotional memory. Dr. Keller suggested the participants might be projecting familiar voices onto ambiguous sounds, a known psychological effect when the brain searches for patterns. However, the timing was too consistent to ignore. Even more unusual, the volunteers began reporting similar phrases from the voices they heard. Myra said her father asked if she could hear him clearly. Marcus described hearing nearly the same question from his brother. Elena reported her sister saying something strangely reassuring, as if speaking from a distance. When Jacob asked if the recordings contained hidden speech signals, the technicians insisted the audio files were purely generated noise. Yet Daniel noticed something that didn't fit the theory of simple imagination. The volunteers claimed the voices sometimes responded when they spoke back. Curiosity began to replace hesitation, and the volunteers started experimenting during their listening sessions. When the voices appeared, they quietly asked questions into the microphones placed in front of them. Myra asked her father if he could hear her, and she later said the voice responded in a calm and familiar tone. Marcus decided to test the phenomenon carefully by asking something only he and his brother would know. When the answer seemed correct, he sat back in stunned silence. The research team insisted the microphones were only recording audio and were not connected to any external system that could send responses. Still, the volunteers felt as though they were having real conversations. Some of them felt a sense of emotional relief, while others began to worry that something about the experiment was not fully understood. Daniel noticed that even the researchers seemed increasingly tense as the volunteers reported longer and more detailed responses. Late one evening, when the laboratory had grown quiet, Jacob managed to speak privately with Priya in the monitoring room surrounded by glowing computer screens. She explained that the project had originally started as a study of how the human brain interprets noise and reconstructs speech patterns. During early experiments, researchers discovered that certain sound frequencies could trigger extremely vivid memory responses in participants. The team then developed equipment designed to stimulate those neural patterns and convert them into subtle audio signals that the brain could recognize as voices. The technology was initially intended as a therapeutic tool to help people process grief by recreating familiar voices from memory. But the newest data suggested something far more complicated. Some of the phrases reported by volunteers did not match any known memories or recordings. It was as if the system was producing responses that went beyond what the brain alone should have been able to recreate. For the final phase of the experiment, all 7 volunteers agreed to participate in a synchronized listening session. Each person sat in a separate soundproof room while the system connected their equipment through a central control program. As the audio frequencies began to play, the familiar static slowly filled the headphones. Within minutes, the volunteers once again started hearing the voices they recognized. Myra heard her father speaking softly. Marcus heard his brother's voice. Elena recognized the gentle tone of her sister. But soon the voices seemed to shift, speaking words that several volunteers reported hearing at the same time. The phrase repeated across different rooms, asking the same quiet question. The technicians watched nervously as identical patterns appeared across multiple recording channels. When the session finally ended, the volunteers compared what they had heard and realized the voices had spoken in perfect synchronization. Dr. Keller shut down the experiment immediately. Yet later, while reviewing the recordings, Daniel noticed something strange in the final transcript. Alongside the voices the volunteers recognized, another voice appeared, one that none of them could identify. It spoke only once, asking a simple and unsettling question: who opened the door?